So now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Chris Jackson, a seasoned political pollster and Senior Vice President of Ipsos's political polling team. Chris, you have the floor.
Great. Thank you, Ellen. Greetings, everyone. Thanks for being here today. Appreciate you taking some time out of, I'm sure, very busy schedules to join us. As always, we have a lot of data to share with you from the public opinion work that Ipsos is doing. As always, if you've joined these before, we encourage you to submit questions, and I'll certainly allot some time towards the end of the session to answer them. You can use the Q&A field in the GoToWebinar application to enter those questions at any time. Also, this is being recorded and will be available on the Ipsos website. The deck itself will also be on the Ipsos website. All of this data is public data, so you're certainly welcome to reference it or use it if you would like. All right, so let's get started. So the agenda is actually a little bit more simple today than has been in some of the past webinars we've done. I'm really just going to talk about sort of what the issue landscape is in the United States right now, just to do a little context setting. And then we're really just going to dive into the 2022 midterm elections and sort of how things are starting to shape up. We've already had several primary elections across the country, so we're really starting to see some of how the election is going to play out coming into focus a little bit better. So I'm going to spend a good chunk of the time today really looking more closely at a lot of that data. But first, let's talk about the main issues. Let's talk about some of the context for the country. This is from the Reuters Ipsos tracking poll. This is a poll we've been fielding every month and then every week since 2012, looking at a number of issues, including presidential approval. And this question, what the most important problem facing America is. This question, though, because we've been tracking it for a decade, is relatively inflexible. We don't change it much so that we don't damage our ability to trend. So sometimes it does miss sort of key events. For instance, school shootings, mass shootings aren't really included clearly in this. There's crime and corruption, which is sort of an imperfect capture for that. But also, healthcare is not really a perfect capture for the coronavirus crisis. So anyways, but I think the main point is to just illustrate how the the economy, unemployment, and jobs is very clearly the plurality main issue for Americans. This is a question where we ask them to select one. And you can see it's about a third of Americans right now saying that that's the single biggest issue facing the country. Crime, environment, healthcare, which are sort of the next group, are all tied somewhere in the 10 to 15% range right there. So the economy is very clearly sort of a dominant issue right now. But again, I think the historical vantage point is important. It's not nearly as dominant as it was in 2012 after the Great Recession, where the economy was much, much, much stronger of a factor sort of driving America. And I'll get to sort of why that is in a moment. But like I said, this question, because it's a trend question, it is a little bit inflexible. So we also ask this question sort of different ways. And this is from a new survey that we are doing with 538. It's a monthly survey of Americans that we'll be doing from May every month through the election this year. And the cool thing about this particular survey is we're going back to the same people every month. So we'll actually be able to see how individuals change over time through the course of the election. But this question is, what topics are of the biggest worry to you personally? They're allowed to select up to 3, so it's not just a select one. And we are, since it's a newer question, able to have a lot more granularity in it. And I wanted to sort of point out 2 things. One is that inflation or increasing costs is clearly the aspect of the economy that's dominating American concern. That's not really a surprise to anyone who's, following things or buying gas anytime recently. But you can see over half of Americans list that as one of their main worries. And the number this is the change from May to June, has been relatively stable. Hasn't really changed a lot over time. And then other aspects of the economy, things like economic inequality, 9%, unemployment, 3%. These are not nearly as dominant right now because they're just not, that's not really people's worry about the economy. The other thing I want to call out to you is how crime or gun violence has substantially jumped, basically doubled in the number of Americans saying that that's a worry since our May survey. And the May survey was fielded just before the shooting in Buffalo, New York, and certainly before the shooting in Uvalde, Texas. And then the June survey was fielded earlier this month. So we have sort of a pre-post capture, and we can see how much more Americans are concerned about that in the aftermath of these two horrific events. And then aside from that, there's not a lot of change. This +1, -1, maybe even +2, -2, all within the margin of error. So that's pretty much flat. The only other thing that sort of climbed a bit is abortion, up 6 points to 10 overall. So not a huge topic, but that coming in the wake of a leaked draft opinion about the Roe v. Wade decision potentially being overturned. So we have an issue landscape where it's inflation, it's costs, it's price pressures, clear number one, consistent number one, but also crime and gun violence sort of climbing as a major concern. And I'll return to that in a few minutes. But digging into the economy and economic measures, this is our consumer confidence tracker from 2002 to now. So we've been tracking this for 20 years on a monthly basis, and then on a weekly basis since the start of the pandemic. And you can see that the consumer confidence is been a little bit chaotic, has been a little bit sort of all over the place during the Great Recession. Certainly had that recovery up through sort of the vaccine effort in last summer when there's sort of a lot of good vibes, and then a pretty steady decline since then, particularly in the face of inflation pressures, but also with sort of the various coronavirus waves that have come back. That first drop in sort of, that's actually late summer, was basically the Delta wave of the coronavirus sort of killed some of the enthusiasm. And in fact, the index that's coming out today has the overall consumer confidence below the 50 threshold. So it's at 49 and some change, which is sort of our sort of rule of thumb measure for sort of bad confidence, goods above 50, bads below 50. So we're definitely in a picture where Americans are sort of more pessimistic than optimistic about the shape of the economy. But the thing that's really separating this economic period from the sort of earlier Great Recession period in 2009, 2010, 2012 is the data that's actually being shown in this slide. So this is, again, from our consumer confidence tracker, and it is people's perceived job security, that's the orange line, and their their ability to make other household purchases, which are sort of the regular things you need to sort of support your life, toilet paper, food, all that kind of things. And it's a very interesting phenomenon. They're very closely linked through the early parts of the pandemic. They dropped, actually, this is actually just after the first US lockdown. Line should be a further over to the side, but that 34 number at the start is essentially right after the first lockdown, just big drop, steady climb through the vaccination campaign. And then we've seen this sort of delinkage between the two where they're not as closely tracked anymore. To the point now where most Americans are actually relatively comfortable about their job security, but increasingly are feeling the pressure on that ability to make other household purchases. And that's the key difference between this particular economic climate in 2009, 2010, is in that period, people were much less secure about their jobs, much less secure about their employment picture. So there was both a livelihood, ability to sort of make a living concern, as well as the ability to afford things. Whereas this time it's much more isolated in that ability to afford things. So it's not quite as dire or as deep an amount of pessimism as we saw last go around, at least, not yet. Hopefully not ever, but not yet. And then this is, again, another data point from our consumer confidence tracker, just illustrating a related data point. This is the comfort making major household purchases. So this is sort of larger expenses like a car or a major appliance or a renovation or something like that. And the thing I really just want to point out to you is how among less affluent households with an income of $50,000 or less, there hasn't actually been a whole lot of change because they never made a lot of progress out of out of the pandemic, out of the sort of the pressures at the beginning of the pandemic. There was certainly a little bit of a rally last summer, some confidence, but certainly not a huge change. On the other hand, households that were more affluent, who have 100,000 or more household income, saw a pretty pronounced increase in their ability to make purchases through last summer. And then they've actually are the group that's seen sort of the biggest loss. So that's why in this particular recession, we're seeing more affluent households who sort of have been doing well, generally speaking, are also some of the ones sort of feeling the pinch right now, versus less affluent households who honestly have been feeling the pinch all along, right? So they're not really, they're not seeing declines because they never improved in the first place, right? They were at a lower level to start with. And even now, we are still seeing more affluent households are still more confident, more comfortable with it, making purchases, you know, even with the sort of the slides driven by sort of inflationary pressures. So just an important context on the economy to keep in mind. All right, so now turning to the election, and this is really the meat of the discussion today. I want to start off by talking about the priority list for Joe Biden. This is again from our Reuters Ipsos Core Political Tracker. This should not come as much of a surprise that the majority of Americans think that Biden should be focusing on the economy. That matches the main worry. Everything else on the list is kind of a second tier. We don't have, again, because this is a tracking question, we don't actually have guns or gun violence on the list. So, you know, there probably would be some people talking about that, but it does illustrate the extent to which the economy is sort of a singular focus, and not even employment and jobs part of the economy. It is, I think, very clearly about inflation and price pressures. That's where Americans want the president and government sort of focus to be. And Biden, you know, because I think largely because of inflation, because of costs continuing to climb, we've seen Biden's approval rating continuing to slide. In fact, he was down to 39% approval in the core political data we released yesterday. I just didn't have a chance to update the slide. 41% was the week before. You know, and this is, you can see a pretty steady downward trend in his approval ratings. There is probably a floor that he's not going to really go below because the Democratic Party continues to be pretty solidly behind him. His approval rating among Democrats is still around 80%. So, you know, it suggests he probably won't drop below sort of the mid-30s because that's about the proportion of the population in the Democratic Party. But it is clear Republicans have been very much opposed to Biden from the outset, continue to be very much opposed to Biden, and he's lost a lot of ground with independents who started off giving him a lot of benefit of the doubt, but now at a better than a 2-to-1 ratio are disapproving to approving of his job performance. And that's important because that feeds into the midterm elections. The midterm elections, in a lot of ways, particularly at the congressional level, are strongly influenced by how people view the president. And indeed, if you look sort of over the historical record, the party that controls the White House has lost major numbers of seats in Congress in, I think it was 19 out of 20 of those elections, or maybe it was 18 out of 20 of those sort of midterm elections. The other thing I want to point out, though, again, just sort of for sort of larger context setting, is how few Americans actually take part in congressional elections as a sense of the population. So this is all American adults. So, you know, this is the full population of people over the age of 18. And how many people took part, voted rather, in the congressional elections for Democrats or Republicans versus how many didn't take part, didn't vote. You can see that presidential years always have a higher level of turnout. So that'd be 2000, 2004, every 4 years after that. Then midterm years. And then on average, a midterm sees 32 maybe percent of the adult population on average taking part. 2018 had a very high turnout for a midterm when 44% of the adult population took part. But, you know, in the typical midterm, what we see is that essentially 18 or 19% of the US adult population is deciding who ends up running Congress, right? That's the number of Americans who actually make a decision about who is going to be running the show here. It's not, you know, a popular majority in any way, shape, or form because most Americans aren't taking part. And this is where I say you should definitely go out and vote. But the other thing to note here is that Republicans and Democrats at the congressional level have actually been pretty balanced over the last 2 decades since 2020. Indeed, the average over this period is about, I think it's about, for midterms, it's 18% each. For both midterms and presidential years, I think it's 20 versus 21 or 21 versus 22, with Democrats having a slight advantage, but not a huge one. And that's actually different than the presidential level, where Democrats have won the popular vote 5 times out of 6 since the 2020 elections, even though they haven't actually won the White House that many times, Electoral College. So again, I think the key takeaway here, though, is that most Americans aren't going to take part in the midterm this election, and that a relative small number of Americans will actually be deciding who ends up winning. And when you introduce primaries into the discussion as well, it's an even smaller chunk of Americans who are actually determining who leads the country, because in many, many districts, the primary winner for whichever party sort of is dominant in the district is the one who's going to win the general election. So, for instance, relatively infamously, Marjorie Taylor Greene represents North Georgia, a very solidly Republican district she's in. She's almost certain to win the general election this fall. Won her primary with a total of about 70,000 votes. Now, 70,000 votes may sound like a lot, but again, in her very solidly Republican district, the Democrat in 2020 got more than 70,000 votes. So it is a minority of district voters who are deciding that she's going to be the standard bearer for that district for, the Republican Party right now. Even if, maybe the larger number of people in that district or in the country may be a little uncomfortable with her antics. So then turning to data. So this is again from our 538 polling. The first 2 lines are at any rate. So this is the congressional midterm election ballot. So we asked people, who would you vote for Congress, the Republican candidate or the Democratic candidate? Someone else, or would you not vote? And we see essentially that Republicans have a small 2 percentage point advantage right now amongst all Americans. 45% say they wouldn't vote. Now, you can already probably see that there are probably more people saying that they'd vote Democrat or Republican than actually will, given that, again, the average turnout is somewhere in the low 30s. But this is where we sort of are at this particular point in time. Republicans with a small advantage in the generic congressional ballot. And then we also ask Americans, how likely are they to vote? 42% say that they're certain or almost certain. Another 20% say that they're very likely. 38% say that they're somewhat or not likely. And even that 42% and the almost certain are probably more people than will actually take part in the election this year. And then finally, just as a comparison point, the 2020 election results here. This is the actual results. 32% of American adults voted for Joe Biden, 29% voted for Donald Trump, and 39% either voted for the third party candidate, which I think was about 2% total, or did not vote in the election. So you can again see that we're not really talking about large majorities of Americans. I mean, when people talk about election results, they're talking about the people who took part in the election. So it's, 51 versus 49 or what have you. But when you look at it as a facet of the entire population, you can actually see how in a lot of these cases, we're not really seeing majority rule in any real way, shape, or form. So this is a little bit of a complicated chart, but I think it's really important. So this is looking at the 2022 electorate, combining those 3 factors I showed on that previous slide. And the boxes to really pay attention to are the dark red, certain Republican voters, the dark blue, certain Democratic voters, and then the 2 purple boxes. And these are essentially the people that we think are actually likely to take part in the election this fall, right? So what we did is we combined, did they say they were certain to vote, who they said that they were going to vote for, and then how they voted in 2020. And what we can see here is that amongst people who are sort of existing Trump or Republican voters, existing Biden or Democratic voters. Republicans right now are doing a slightly better job of turning out Trump's base. You can essentially see that they're turning out about 50% of Trump's vote versus Democrats who are only turning out about 40% of Biden's vote. And there is a small population of Americans, it's only about 3% total, who are changing sort of their vote preference from 2020 to 2022. Primarily, they're people who either voted independent or didn't vote in 2020 who say they're going to vote in 2022. But those people are by about 5 to 1 swinging towards Republicans this year. So that's also giving Republicans a bit of an advantage. So if we, if Democrats were turning out Biden voters at equal sort of percentages as Republicans are turning out Trump voters, it'd be a tie. If the swing vote didn't exist, it would be a tie. So there's a couple of different factors that are leading to this sort of small but significant, meaningful Republican advantage going into the election. So looking at that last slide by different demographic factors, though, I think it starts to show some of the reasons why Democrats are struggling this year. So this is looking at that last chart by generation. This is the definition Pew provides for generation, with Gen Z being people up to sort of mid-20s, millennials being late 20s through 30s, Gen X being 40s through mid to late 50s, boomers being 60s to sort of mid 70s, and then the silent generation being people in sort of their late 70s and older. And I think there's a couple of things to call out, but the first one is how clear there is sort of a trend of people voting more as they get older or voting less when they're younger. Where Gen Z and millennials, we basically see half or more than half of them falling in that habitual non-voter block. Now, some of that is because they're, like particularly for Gen Z, some of them might not have been old enough to vote in 2020, but even putting that aside, among the millennials, you can still see the trend holding up, and millennials are all certainly old enough to have been able to vote in 2020, where there is this very clear trend of people as they age are more likely to take part in elections, more likely to vote. And then the second thing is to sort of look at those ratios between the certain voters and then the non-committed voters. And if you look at, for instance, baby boomers, you can see that the ratio of certain voters to non-committed voters are basically about half and half, and indeed in some cases, like amongst Republicans, they're actually turning out a little bit more than half of the potential support in that block, versus amongst millennials and Gen Z, where the certain voters are actually a minority of the total potential support that exists. And what this is essentially saying is that Democrats particularly are struggling to get young people to turn out to vote. And since Democrats have an advantage with young people, they beat Republicans 2 to 3 to 1 with younger Americans. The fact that young people are not engaged is really dragging back Democrats' potential vote in the election. Whereas Republicans, because they rely on an older cohort of voters, Gen X, baby boomers, silent generation, those people are more likely to take part. They're essentially advantaged still going into the election. And then the other piece is looking at this same set of data by race and ethnicity. And here, too, we see a trend that's advantaging Republicans. Particularly, Republicans are, generally speaking, pull most of their support from white Americans. That's where it's the majority of the population is still white Americans, and Republicans sort of win that racial or ethnic group, get more votes from there. And they seem to continue to do that. Now, it's interesting to note that Democrats are actually mobilizing an equal portion of their potential white voter base as Republicans, but because Republicans have such a larger share, they're winning out of that. Now, Democrats do much better among Black Americans and Hispanic Americans, but you can see here that essentially only about 1 in 3, a little more than 1 in 3 Black Americans and about 1 in 3 Hispanic Americans who are potential Democratic supporters who voted for Biden in 2020 are saying they're likely to vote this year. So this is, again, a place where Democrats are suffering, that the people who make up a lot of their potential vote, their base, are just not committed to voting this year. They're just not engaged or energized going into the election, versus Republicans who primarily are based on white voters who do appear to be more engaged, more likely to vote. Then looking at that small sliver of swing voters, so again, it's about 3% of the population, there's some interesting factors about that. One, they don't seem to like anybody, except Republicans in Congress, where they have a somewhat favorable opinion. But you can see that they don't like Democrats, they don't like Biden, they don't really like Trump. I mean, they're a little warmer on Trump than they are on Biden and Democrats, but that's not what I would call a good number. But they are pretty positive on Republicans in Congress. And I'm essentially interpreting this as this group, this sort of 2%, are a lot of the people who may have left the Republican Party in 2020, or people who are sort of Republican leaning in 2020 because they found Trump personally distasteful. So they voted independent or they didn't take part in the election. And they're sort of coming home now, right? They're sort of coming back to where they were before. Now, our data doesn't go that far back, so we can't necessarily say that conclusively. But if you look at their profile, they do look to be white. They do look to be sort of more highly educated, more suburban. So they sort of profile out as sort of more like, Republican-esque in sort of how they look. So I think this is why we're seeing in that swing vote right now, them sort of leaning towards Republicans, because I think they're kind of Republican, never Trumpers to start with. But, as we go into the election season, we are seeing issue priority shifting. Like I mentioned before, from May to June, there has been a pronounced increase in the number of Americans who are worried about crime or gun violence. Even as inflation has remained relatively stable, hasn't really moved as the main issue people are concerned about, still dominating people's mindscape, there is sort of the potential for sort of new issues to sort of shuffle up the landscape a little bit, even as some other issues like political extremism or race or climate change or immigration are kind of not really moving much. And this is sort of happening, I think, because we're seeing some groups, and this is again sort of that sort of six-part depiction of the electorate, sort of feeling these issues a little bit differently. And I think the thing that's most interesting is how Biden non-voters, so these are the people who voted for Biden in 2020 but aren't committed to voting Democratic this year, actually are more worried about crime or gun violence than even sort of the current Democratic voters. This suggests that group could potentially be activated by this issue. I think it's why you're seeing Democrats sort of pushing on it a lot. And I think a lot of this is because this group of Biden non-voters is disproportionately Black and Hispanic. Black and Hispanic Americans were the victims of these two mass shootings recently in Buffalo and Uvalde. So there is, I think, a certain personal stake people are feeling with that, in a way that some of the other issues that we're sort of seeing discussed, I don't think break through. So for instance, abortion, which I don't have on the slide, which is probably a mistake on my part, you don't see Biden non-voters caring more about abortion than Democratic voters. It's by far Democratic voters who are worried about that. In fact, it looks sort of similar to that political extremism or polarization chart, though further to the side because it's only a 10% issue. And that's typically what we see in a lot of these sort of culture war issues, where the committed Republicans or committed Democrats are the ones who are sort of at the extremes. Everybody else is kind of in the middle somewhere. But crime or gun violence is sort of shuffling that up a little bit, with it becoming an issue that is, I think, more broad-based, potentially mobilizing for a larger number of Americans. But, when we look at our data in the 538 survey, we're not really seeing a large shift. So this is just among the people who took part in both our May and June survey. If you read our May release, you actually would have seen that among likely voters, we were actually at R+5. But because the composition isn't exactly the same, we're rebasing it to people who are in both surveys. And we see that there's not a substantial shift, even as this sort of issue landscape is shifting. Amongst likely voters, the Republican advantage was 2.5 points in May with this sample of people who took part in both surveys, and in June it's 2 points. So, a slight move towards Democrats, but not a substantial move towards Democrats. And I think that really illustrates the challenge for Democrats, or the opportunity for Republicans going into the midterms, that in a lot of ways, people's ideas or attitudes on what's going to happen are kind of fixed. Now, of course, a lot of the action elections don't really take place until the fall, so it'll be August, September, October before we expect to see a lot of attention. But at least at this point earlier on, attitudes appear to be relatively fixed. People are not really moving a lot. There's a lot of consistency in people's positions and preferences over time, even with sort of events happening out in the world. So the open question that we're getting a lot right now is, will the January 6th hearings have an impact? And if you've been following them, they've been very dramatic. I think they've been making a good case for, or they've been doing a good job, rather, making a case of, why the January 6th events were sort of coordinated and intentional and not just, typical political protest. But I'm a little bit skeptical that I think it's going to have an impact, because we do see pretty entrenched positions amongst Americans going into it. This is from a Reuters Ipsos poll we did just before the hearing started. You can see that most Americans aren't really following it. It's only 15% say they're following it a great deal, another 25% a fair amount. And then when we asked in the same survey what people thought about the 2020 election, we still see a substantial number of Americans, 30%, saying that the election was the result of illegal voting or election rigging, including a majority of Republicans, 58%. And in the face of that kind of, entrenched attitudes, I'm not terribly optimistic that facts are going to move people. But I think as we sort of are looking forward through the rest of the summer into the fall, into the election, it is going to be sort of important to keep track of what's being talked about and what's being discussed. So this is again from our 538 Ipsos polling. This is both our May and June surveys, and I plotted out just a handful of data points by how much people had seen about it in the news, by how much they thought it was a main issue for the country. Main issue news coverage along the bottom, main issue for the country along the sides. And you can see that there's a bit of a relationship between what people see in the news and what they think is a major topic. Not a perfect relationship. It's not, a straight line, because I think there is a sort of a determining factor that I'll get to in a minute that sort of drives that. But you can see, for instance, inflation, which is the number one issue facing the country, also something that people are reporting seeing a ton of news coverage about. In June, crime, gun violence got a lot of coverage, again, after the two mass shootings. You can see it has really gone up in terms of the main issue. And you can see actually in May, crime and gun violence was much further down, sort of right here in sort of the middle of the chart. But even beyond that, so for instance, for international conflicts, which you can sort of see towards the bottom, in May, it got more news coverage and it was seen as a more major issue. In June, it's gotten less news coverage, reported news coverage, and it's subsided. So there is this relationship between what people are seeing on the news and what they think is the main issue. But the important thing that sort of filters that and sort of determines what it really drives opinion is how personal people feel it is. So this is that main issue for America versus how worried people are about it individually. And here you can see almost a perfect line. The correlation here is like 98%, where people, if they feel personally worried about it, it's something that they're upset about or worried about, they think it's a major issue for the country, right? So it's that sort of old adage that the personal is political, is really, I think, very important to keep in mind as we're sort of looking at events that may happen over the next couple of months, or how the January 6th committee hearing sort of plays out. And I think the big question, particularly for the January 6th committee, is, do people feel a personal sense of worry or concern, some sort of personal risk coming out of these committee hearings? Because if they don't, I just don't think it's going to make a big impact. It's not going to really break through. I can't necessarily say how well it's being perceived yet. We are going to do more research on it once it's done next week with Reuters. But I think we'll have to return to this, in a month or two to really see how it's developing. But I think this is the thing to keep in mind, is that people are going to project their individual level worries out as what the country should be dealing with. And that's sort of the way it's, I think, always been. And it's certainly driven by news coverage and what people are seeing, but it's filtered through, do they feel a personal stake in it? So going into the election, this is the map of the Senate for Senate. So the Senate is really sort of, I've been mostly talking about the House of Representatives and the elections there because honestly it's easier to poll, though the Senate is probably the locus of power right now in the United States, the balance of power in the United States. It's 50-50. Democrats have an advantage because of the vice president's tie-breaking vote. And essentially it could go either way this election. There are both Republican and Democratic seats that are up for grabs. Senate elections are oftentimes a little bit less driven by the president's approval ratings. They're a little bit more localized. So whereas congressional elections, it was like 18 out of 20 have gone against the president. In Senate elections, it's more like like 12 out of 20. So it's not nearly as perfect a relationship. But, going into the midterms, we haven't really seen any data that would make us think that we should change our sort of scenario planning. We still think it's very likely that Republicans have wins, probably take control of the House of Representatives, probably maybe take control of the U.S. Senate, though the Senate, again, is a little bit more of an even split kind of situation. And then pretty unlikely, at least at this moment, that Democrats are able to hold on to the White House and the Senate. Hold on to the Senate and the House of Representatives. They'll still hold on to the White House. That's an election that's further away from now. And I think really the big thing that would potentially change this dynamic is inflation. And if inflation starts to cool, we may see this picture change. But absent that, because that is the main worry, I just don't know if I really expect a lot to change anytime in the near term. All right, so that's it. So questions. So again, please feel free to use that Q&A field in the GoToWebinar application, and I look forward to seeing what you have for me. All right, first question. What impact would the potential deal in the Senate on gun control have? It's a good question. I don't think it'll have a huge impact, the potential gun control legislation that'll be coming out. But if anything, I think it would probably help neutralize a little bit of the advantage Democrats are getting in enthusiasm, because it'll be like they've gotten a win. They can sort of go on, look at other stuff. Democrats are always very adept at sort of having things distract them. It's, just sort of how they are. So I think, I don't think honestly it'll shift things very much in terms of the election. I think in terms of the country, we'll see if what legislation is produced, if it's something that could prevent a future mass shooting. That's certainly a good thing. But electorally speaking, I don't think it'll have a big difference. Let's see, what else do we got? What is the impact of gas prices on how things are going? So I think you can't really separate gas prices from inflation overall. Gas prices are very high. People, I think I've been seeing a lot of reports that they're averaging $5 a gallon or more. I think that is really part and parcel of the larger concern of inflation. I think it's, though, probably the most real aspect of it, because gas prices are that thing that people see very clearly every couple of days, week, however often you have to fill up your vehicle, in front of you, and you're looking at it, right? When you're filling up your car, you put the thing in and you hit your button and it starts, and in a way that, like, prices and a lot of other things aren't as literally in your face. It's right at eye line. I think it's really interesting the way gas prices stick in people's minds, unlike other things. So I think it's probably the most visible version or aspect of inflation, but I think it's a much larger thing of people who honestly probably felt a little bit squeezed already, feeling increasingly squeezed, feeling sort of a hard time. And especially when you add that on top of the last 2 years of the precariousness of the pandemic and how sort of, were we all supposed to hide? Were we supposed to be back out in our lives? Is the vaccine going to save us? Is, COVID going to break through the vaccine? You add all that together and there's just, a real sense of precariousness, and now sort of a sense that people are like losing ground. That I think gas prices are really just the most visible, sort of the surface of the iceberg, if I'm allowed to mix my metaphors a little bit, but there's a much larger iceberg underneath that, that I think is running into, continue my metaphor here, is running into President Biden and Democrats' chances, and probably going to sink them. All right, let's see what else. If the Supreme Court strikes down Roe versus Wade as expected, what is your anticipated impact on voting, particularly among younger, more progressive voters? Intuitively, it would seem to be a benefit for Democratic candidates. I think that's a good question. Again, we don't know yet, right? I think right now we're not seeing much of an impact of abortion, but it's also still a little bit of an inside baseball story because it's a leaked opinion. Who knows if it's real or not? It's not really affected anything yet. My hunch, though, is that it doesn't really move the needle a lot unless the Democrats are able to sort of make larger hay about it and inflation starts to subside a little bit, because the people that are most concerned with abortion, at least right now, are people who are already committed Democratic voters. So essentially the people who'd be fired up are already voting, right? It's the people who probably support legal abortion, but it's just not their top issue. They're more worried about inflation or their pocketbook or things like that. That's the group Democrats need to turn out. And it's an open question on how much abortion will be an effective mobilization tool for them. I think one of the challenges Democrats are particularly facing, as your question there was asking, is among younger Americans. It seems to be that a lot of this is being portrayed more as a failure of the Democratic Party than as Republicans doing bad things, and you should support Democrats to, stop it, with young people, right? So what we're seeing is young people increasingly becoming independent, non-political, apolitical, what have you. Now, historically, young people have always been less likely to affiliate with the party. That's just sort of a life stage thing. But there does seem to be a very pronounced disillusionment amongst younger Americans, even younger Americans who voted for Biden, with the Democratic Party, which makes me a little bit skeptical that the Democratic Party will do a good job mobilizing on. And with their standard bearer is Joe Biden. I mean, Joe Biden is, I don't think anyone's probably idea of someone who's going to make a very convincing case of why people should be caring about abortion, 80-year-old man. Doesn't seem to be much impact about Putin, Ukraine. What impact could that have? So we are still doing research on the topic. We're seeing Americans' positions are pretty stable and continue to be supportive of Ukraine, supportive of sending them weapons, sending them money, taking in refugees, all that kind of stuff. No real change in that sense of support, but it definitely has fallen off the radar of Americans as something that they're like worried about on a day-to-day basis. And as I showed you on that chart, we're just not seeing as much coverage of it in the news media. People just aren't worrying about it. It's not the thing that, people are watching sort of these very vivid, dramatic videos. So I think, for your question, there's two-parter. Like, what does this have to do with how will this impact Ukraine? Well, I think as long as policymakers sort of continue to sort of maintain, sort of a large majority of support for aiding Ukraine, we probably won't see any major policy changes. I do think there is a potential risk because there is this increasingly sort of small but growing sort of part of the MAGA caucus, sort of, Republican, very conservative wing of the Republican Party, who are sort of like anti-Ukraine, pro-Russia. It's certainly not enough to actually stop any legislation at this point, but, I think the question becomes, if it becomes a campaign issue, then all of a sudden you might see all Republicans sort of pivoting in that direction. We certainly saw in 2016, for instance, Republicans who, for 60 years had made being hostile to Russia and the Soviet Union before that sort of part of their platform. We're all of a sudden talking about how Putin's a great guy and how Putin's actually a better leader than American Democrats and, stuff like that. So, I think there is potential vulnerability there if it becomes a campaign issue. But I think right now it's not something that is really driving a lot of voting behavior. All right, so those are all the questions I have. Again, thank you for your time today. I appreciate it. We will be back with you in August. That'll be actually just before sort of the official kickoff of campaign season in the fall. In the meantime, you can follow all of our research on the Ipsos website, ipsos.com/news and polls. In addition to all of the work we're doing with all of our media partners, If you have any questions, I certainly invite you to reach out to us. We're always happy to chat, and have a great day. Thank you. Thank you so much. Be good.